They gathered before dawn. Men, women, children, their faces gray with cold and something heavier than grief. No one spoke. No one dared. The air hung thick with waiting, the kind that comes before something irreversible. In the center of the square, a wooden post stood alone, splintered, rough, wrapped with rope that had seen too much. A young woman was led forward, her hands bound, her eyes fixed on the frozen ground. Every step she took echoed across the cobblestones like a drumbeat no one wanted to hear. Soldiers flanked her sides, eyes fixed ahead, boots striking in perfect rhythm. Some couldn't look at her. Others stared, as if memorizing her face for reasons they couldn't explain. She stopped. The wind cut through the square. Someone whispered a prayer that was swallowed by silence. The officer read her sentence, the words lost beneath the hum of the crowd, a sea of breath and bitterness. She did not beg. She did not cry. When they asked for her final words, she lifted her head and spoke softly, so softly that only the man nearest her could hear. He would remember those words for the rest of his life. A pause. Then, the order. The rifles rose. The world seemed to stop. A single tear traced down her cheek, catching the morning light for an instant before the shots rang out. The echo rolled across the ruins of a war that was supposed to be over. But for her, and for those who watched, it never truly ended. The gunfire that morning was not the first to echo across Europe, but it was one of the last. The war had ended months before, yet peace had not found its way into the hearts of the people. Towns lay in ruins. Families searched through ashes for names that would never answer. In the rubble of victory, hatred had learned to speak a new language, justice without mercy. The flags had changed, the uniforms had changed, but the hunger for retribution had not. Across France, across Belgium, across the broken streets of Warsaw and Berlin, the victors were cleaning the wounds of war, and in that cleansing, more blood was spilled. Among the names whispered in taverns and marketplaces was hers, Marie Becker. To some, she was a woman who sold her soul to the enemy. To others, a scapegoat, caught between survival and accusation. Before the war, she had been a nurse. She tended to the wounded, Allied and German alike, in a small field hospital near Liège. When the occupation came, she did what she could to live. She treated whoever was brought before her, believing mercy did not wear a uniform. But when the Germans retreated, her kindness became her crime. Neighbors she had known since childhood turned away. One morning, her door was broken down. The people she had once cared for dragged her into the streets, calling her collaborator. She was paraded through the square, her head forced low as the crowd screamed for punishment. Some spat at her. Others watched in silence, unable to decide what justice really meant anymore. The war had taught them how to hate, but not how to stop. The new authorities promised trials, investigations, order. But order was slow, and anger was quick. In towns across Europe, men and women were judged not by evidence, but by rumor, by memory, by vengeance. For Marie, there would be no courtroom. No chance to explain. The decision had already been made, not by law, but by grief. In those days, guilt was a word that changed shape depending on who spoke it. And on that cold morning, in the eyes of a broken nation, Marie Becker became the face of an enemy long gone. They called her the Witch of Liège. They said she poisoned soldiers, whispered secrets to German officers, and dined with the enemy while her neighbors starved. In a time when truth had become a luxury, stories were enough to condemn. Someone claimed they had seen her laughing with an SS captain. Another swore she had worn a German brooch beneath her coat. In the eyes of the broken, every small kindness shown to the wrong side became an unforgivable act. She was taken to a makeshift holding cell, an old storeroom behind the police station, its walls cracked by shellfire. The guards were young, most no older than the men who had gone to the front and never returned. They didn't know her. They only knew what the crowd shouted. Her name, once spoken with respect, was now spit into the dirt. The interrogations began at dusk. A single lamp hung from the ceiling, its weak light swinging as the wind moved through broken windows. Across the tables sat men in uniform, tired, bitter, and unsure whether they were seeking justice or revenge. "Why did you help them?" one of them asked. Her hands shook as she tried to answer, her voice hoarse from hours without water. "I helped everyone," she said. "I treated the wounded. I didn't ask what flag they fought under." The officer looked away. He had lost 2 brothers in the war. The man beside him leaned forward, slamming his fist on the table. "Don't lie to us, Becker. We know what you did." But they didn't know. Not really. They had fragments, whispers, the kind of stories born out of grief. Outside, the people gathered again, waiting for word. Mothers who had lost sons. Men who had lost brothers. Children who had learned that justice meant seeing someone suffer. Each hour that passed, the crowd grew larger, angrier. They carried photographs of the dead, holding them up to the windows as if to remind the soldiers inside what had been taken from them. One of the guards, a boy barely 20, slipped away into the alley, unable to bear the noise. He would later say he had never seen hatred so quiet. Not shouted, not screamed, but held tightly, like a weapon. Marie sat alone, her hands tied behind her chair. The lamp flickered. Shadows stretched across her face, cutting her features into pieces of light and darkness. In that dim room, she remembered her patients, soldiers crying out for their mothers, men who died clutching her hands. She remembered the German officer who had once begged her to save a boy, barely 16, wounded by shrapnel. She had saved him. And now that act, that mercy, was being written as treason. The interrogator returned with a paper in his hand. "Sign this," he said. She looked down, a confession already written for her. She raised her eyes and whispered, "If I sign, will it stop the crowd?" He hesitated. "It might," he said. But his voice betrayed the lie. That night, she heard singing from the square. The crowd had started drinking, the bitterness spilling into celebration. They didn't want her words, they wanted an ending. At dawn, a soldier entered the cell. He placed a coat over her shoulders. His hands trembled as he tied the rope around her wrists. Outside, the wind had changed direction. Smoke from the burned-out town drifted through the streets, mixing with the scent of bread from a bakery that had somehow survived. The streets were lined with people again. Some jeered. Some looked away. A few, those who remembered her kindness, stood silent, trapped between fear and guilt. As she passed, an old man crossed himself. A child threw a stone that missed and clattered against a wall. The soldiers marched her forward, their boots keeping the rhythm of something too familiar. Justice was promised. What followed, was something else entirely. The interrogation room smelled of damp wood and smoke. The same questions had been asked for days, but the answers never changed. Each time they brought her in, the lamp burned a little lower, and the faces across the table grew harder. They wanted her to admit she had betrayed her own. That she had handed names to the enemy, poisoned Allied soldiers, and slept beside the men who had occupied her town. But she said nothing new. Only the same quiet words, that she had tried to keep people alive, not choose who deserved to live. One officer, a captain with gray around his temples, struck the table with his palm. "You think mercy excuses treason?" Her eyes lifted, tired but steady. "No," she said. "I think it proves we were still human." He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Outside, through the window, came the faint echo of shouting. The townspeople had gathered again, chanting her name, demanding an end. A sergeant entered the room, his face flushed from the cold. "They've started throwing stones," he said quietly. "If we don't act soon, they'll break in." The captain said nothing. He stared at the confession paper on the desk, then at the woman before him. Justice had lost its shape. It was no longer about truth, only about calming the rage outside those walls. That night, Marie was left alone in the cell. Rain leaked through the cracks, dripping into a tin cup by her feet. She sat against the wall, the rope around her wrists cutting into her skin. Her breath was shallow. The hours stretched, unbroken by sleep. In her mind, the war replayed in fragments, the hospital tents, the sound of boots, the cries of the wounded. She remembered the boy she had saved, the German with a shattered leg who had pressed a medal into her hand before they took him away. "For your kindness," he had said. That small piece of metal, once a token of gratitude, had now become proof of betrayal. She thought of her mother, long gone. Of her brother, who had vanished into the front lines years ago. The memory of their faces gave her strength, but it also broke something inside her. At dawn, a new interrogator arrived. Younger, quiet, with a uniform too large for his shoulders. He had been at the front, he'd seen camps, executions, villages burned to ash. His eyes were hollow. He read her file in silence. When he looked up, he said softly, "Do you know why they hate you?" She shook her head. "Because they need someone to carry their guilt. Someone to bury it with." He closed the folder. "I can't help you," he whispered. "Not anymore." Outside, the shouting grew louder. Banners waved. Bottles smashed against the station wall. The soldiers standing guard began to tremble, not from cold, but from the pressure of hundreds of eyes demanding blood. In the square, an old woman was shouting through the rain. Her son had died in a German camp. She screamed Marie's name again and again until her voice broke. The soldiers inside heard her and looked away. One of them, the youngest, pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes. He had buried his best friend in a trench outside Cannes. He'd seen too much death to believe this was justice. But the mob didn't care about truth, they wanted blood. That evening, the captain received the order. The local command had decided the trial would not continue. There would be no transfer, no appeals. The people would have their execution. The soldier who doubted stood in silence as the papers were signed. He knew what it meant, and what it would do to all of them. Marie was brought out one last time. She could barely stand. The guard cut the ropes from her wrists and gave her a scrap of bread. She took it, not to eat, but to hold, something human in a place where humanity was almost gone. That night, before the dawn of her final day, she was allowed to write one letter. She wrote slowly, her hand trembling, her eyes blurred from exhaustion. "To whoever finds this," she began, "I do not ask for forgiveness. Only that my name not be used to feed more hatred. The war took everything. Please, let it end here." When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and handed it to the guard, the same young soldier who had once turned away from the shouting. He took it with shaking hands, knowing it might never reach anyone who would care. Outside, thunder rolled over the town. The rain washed the blood from the cobblestones, but not from memory. The order was sealed. The date was set. There would be no more questions. Only answers that no one would want to hear. The verdict came before sunrise. A single page. A single signature. No defense. No plea. No mercy. When the guards entered her cell, she didn't ask what was happening. She already knew. They tied her hands, led her through the corridor, and stepped out into the gray morning light. The sky hung heavy over the square, the same place where the town had once celebrated liberation, now transformed into a stage for retribution. The crowd had already gathered. Men in torn coats. Women clutching children. Faces marked by years of war and hunger. No one spoke. The silence was colder than the wind. Soldiers formed a line near the post. Their boots pressed into the mud. 12 of them, rifles across their chests, eyes fixed on nothing. Marie's steps slowed as she neared the center. The boards beneath her feet creaked. She looked once toward the church tower, where a single bell rope swayed gently in the breeze. Then she turned her eyes to the crowd. There was no anger in her face. Only exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones when a person has stopped fighting time itself. The officer read the sentence aloud. His voice was firm, practiced, without feeling. Each word echoed against the walls, bouncing back over the heads of those gathered. Marie Becker, found guilty of collaboration with the enemy, is hereby sentenced to death by firing squad. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Somewhere, a child began to cry, and the sound was quickly hushed. The soldiers took their positions. Rifles lifted in unison. Metal clinked softly against leather. One man among them trembled. A private, no older than 25. His uniform hung loosely, his hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold his weapon. He had been a prisoner once, in a camp where names were replaced by numbers. He had seen what vengeance looked like when it was endless. Now, as his commander raised his arm to give the order, he felt that same emptiness return, the kind that no victory could ever fill. Marie closed her eyes. A breath escaped her lips, faint, almost peaceful. A guard stepped forward and tied the cloth over her eyes. But before he could finish, she whispered, "Please, let me see the morning." The guard hesitated. Then, quietly, he lowered the cloth. She looked straight ahead, not at the rifles, but at the faces beyond them. The mothers. The fathers. The children who would grow up hearing her name as a curse. The commander raised his hand. The rifles leveled. For a moment, the wind stopped. Even the banners hanging from the walls froze in place. The private in the line couldn't lift his weapon. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. His commander glanced toward him, eyes burning with command. But the young man shook his head. Slowly, he lowered his rifle to the ground. He whispered, "I've seen enough death." The commander's arm stayed raised. Marie turned her head slightly, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." The signal came. A thunderous crack split the morning air. Birds scattered from the rooftops. The sound echoed through the valley, then faded into silence. When the smoke cleared, the soldiers stood motionless. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't move. They simply watched. A single ribbon of smoke rose from the rifles, twisting upward into the cold air. The private stood apart from the others, his rifle still resting in the mud. His face was wet, though no one could tell if it was from rain or tears. A guard approached the body, knelt, and gently lifted the letter from her coat pocket, the one she had written the night before. It was damp, the ink smudged, but the words were still legible. "Let this be the last." The officer read it quietly, folded it again, and handed it back to the young soldier who had refused to fire. The soldier looked toward the crowd, toward the faces twisted in anger, confusion, and shame. Then he walked away, leaving his rifle behind. Behind him, the bell tolled once more. It was over. But the silence that followed would haunt the town for generations. When the last echo of gunfire faded, the crowd stood still. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Then, one by one, they turned and walked away, leaving behind only footprints in the mud and a single wooden post standing alone in the square. Some said she died a traitor. Others said she died for all the wrong reasons. But years later, when the shouting had quieted and the flags had changed again, the stories began to sound different. Those who had watched that morning said they could never forget the look in her eyes, not fear, not hatred, but forgiveness. The town rebuilt. The years passed. Yet even decades later, when the winter wind blew through the square, people said they could still hear the faint echo of that single shot. Across Europe, scenes like this one were repeated thousands of times. In France, in the Netherlands, in Poland, towns seeking justice after years of occupation. Streets that had once been battlefields became stages for revenge. Women accused of collaboration were dragged into public squares, their heads shaved as the crowds jeered. Some were marked with paint, others beaten, others executed without trial. They called it purification. But history would later give it another name, reprisal. Governments, still struggling to rebuild order, often turned a blind eye. Some saw these acts as justice delivered by the people. Others saw them for what they were, a continuation of the violence the war had already unleashed. It's estimated that more than 20,000 women across Europe were punished in this way. Many were guilty only of working in hospitals, in kitchens, or of surviving near the wrong men at the wrong time. The Allied powers would later condemn such reprisals, labeling many of them war crimes in their own right. But for those who lived through it, the words came too late. In one French village, a priest wrote in his journal, "The war is over, yet I see no peace. We have traded uniforms for shame." In another, a Dutch officer recalled how he refused to take part in the public punishments, saying, "We fought to end cruelty, not to inherit it." The photographs that remain show faces, men and women, caught between relief and regret. You can see it in their eyes, the moment they realized that victory had not healed them, only exposed their wounds. The world had defeated fascism, but it had not yet found its humanity. For Marie Becker, no grave was marked. Her name faded from the records, buried beneath the silence of those who survived her. But the letter she wrote, the one found in her coat pocket, remained. Let this be the last. Decades later, a historian uncovered her story among the archives of post-war tribunals. He wrote that her case was not unique, only one of thousands, each echoing the same question. Where does justice end, and vengeance begin? The answer, even now, remains unclear. What is certain is this: when the world celebrated the end of war, it also inherited the burden of what war had done to the human heart. The silence that followed that gunshot was not the silence of peace. It was the sound of a world still learning how to forgive. Her name faded from the records. But her story did not. For years, no one spoke of that morning in the square. The townspeople built new homes, raised new families, and tried to forget. Yet every winter, when the snow covered the cobblestones, someone would place a single white flower where she fell. No one ever claimed it. Decades later, when historians began to uncover the forgotten trials of 1945 and 1946, her name appeared again, written in trembling ink, beside hundreds of others. Each one told the same story: the war had ended, but judgment had not. Marie Becker became a symbol, not of guilt, not of innocence, but of what happens when justice becomes a weapon. The silence that followed her death echoed louder than the shots themselves. It reminded the world that cruelty wears many faces, and that no victory can erase what hatred leaves behind. Across Europe, the post-war purges left wounds that took generations to close. Governments later admitted what many already knew, that in their rush to punish the enemy, they had punished their own. Some called it justice. Others called it vengeance. History calls it a warning. For every war that ends, another begins inside the hearts of those who survive it. The battle to forgive. The battle to understand. What happened in that small town in 1946 was not unique. It was the reflection of a world still searching for its conscience. The archives record her death as one among thousands, a line in a ledger, a name beneath a seal. But behind that line was a heartbeat, a face, a voice that whispered one last plea: let this be the last. That sentence, scrawled in her final letter, became her legacy. A reminder that war is not only fought with bullets, but with memory, and that how we remember decides what kind of peace we truly keep. The world watched in silence once. And in that silence, humanity was tested. The lesson remains the same. The measure of victory is not in who stands at the end, but in what we choose to do with the silence that follows. This is her story. This is our reminder. The square where it happened still stands. The stones are worn now, the wooden post long gone, but the silence remains. Somewhere, beneath layers of time and history, her story still waits, asking the same question that has no clear answer. Was it justice, or was it revenge? The faces that once watched are gone, yet their silence has reached us. And now, it belongs to you, the one listening. When we remember stories like hers, we are not only recalling the past. We are deciding how we see the present. And what kind of people we become when the war is over. Tell me, what do you believe? Was Marie Becker a traitor, or a casualty of a world that had forgotten how to forgive? Leave your thoughts below. Because every time we speak of these moments, we keep them from fading into dust. If stories like this remind you how deeply history still breathes beneath the surface of our world, join us, subscribe, and stay with these untold voices of war. There are many more names, many more letters, many more echoes waiting to be heard. The world once watched in silence. But we don't have to.